A Liberal candidate made a shocking remark suggesting a political opponent could be turned over to Chinese authorities for a bounty. It's a scandal that sparked outrage, an RCMP probe, and a political firestorm for Mark Carney and the Liberal Party. At first, Carney stood by Paul Chiang. Then, after days of pressure, Chiang stepped down. So, what exactly happened here, and what does this mean for Carney and the Liberals as they gear up for an election? Star reporter Raisa Patel joins me from Ottawa to break it all down. Hi, Raisa.
Hi, Saba.
So, let's start with the basics first of all. Who is Paul Chiang?
So, Paul Chiang is the Liberal candidate in the riding of Markham Unionville, and he, until recently, was seeking re-election there. And he's a really interesting guy. On paper, he seems like a star candidate. He was actually born in Pakistan. He speaks about seven languages. So, aside from English, he speaks Mandarin, Cantonese, Hakka, Punjabi, Hindi, Urdu, which means that he can speak many of the languages that his constituents speak. So he's a good get for any party. He was also a police officer for York Regional Police for about 28 years before running for Justin Trudeau's Liberals in 2021. And that's when he actually took the riding from the Conservatives in that election by a margin of fewer than 2,500 votes. So it's not the closest race of all time, but definitely close. And that's probably something that factored into how this situation all unfolded.
Right. So, how does Joe Tay fit into this? Who is he? Why is he a significant figure in the story? And what's his connection to the political situation in Hong Kong? That's kind of like the source of the firestorm, apparently.
Joe Tay is the conservative candidate in Don Valley North, and the controversial comments that Chang made were in reference to Tay. So Tay is a pro-democracy activist. He's a co-founder of an NGO called Hong Konger Station, which is for people from Hong Kong living in Canada. And it's a platform that allows them to express themselves freely and better integrate into Canadian life. Last year, the Associated Press reported that Hong Kong police had issued arrest warrants for several activists wanted for alleged national security offenses. And one of those activists was Tay.
Mhm.
We need to note, of course, that in 2020 and in 2024, China essentially imposed national security laws on people in Hong Kong that have been fairly widely condemned as infringements on freedoms and on human rights. The Canadian government itself has also criticized these laws because they say that they suppress open debate.
Mhm.
So this all means that even though Tay lives in Canada, Hong Kong police essentially have placed a bounty on him valued at 1 million Hong Kong dollars, which is about $184,000 Canadian. And this is a situation that Tay has called outrageous and an example of transnational repression as well.
And so that's how we've kind of ended up here. What exactly did Chang say?
So the story really begins in January.
Mhm.
At this point in time, Tay was actually seeking the conservative nomination in Markham Unionville, which of course is Chang's riding. And Chang was hosting a roundtable with diaspora media outlets in his constituency office. And in a conversation with Chinese language outlet Mingsheng Bao, Chang brought up this bounty. He said, if anyone here brings Tay to the Chinese consulate general in Toronto, you can get this reward. And of course, this is an astonishing thing to say because it essentially, makes light of or legitimizes the human rights concerns in Hong Kong.
Mhm.
It kind of reads as encouraging people in Canada to release Tay to a potentially dangerous fate in order to obtain a reward. And these comments really flew under the radar until Friday, so just a few days ago. When they resurfaced, this story in Ming Shengbao resurfaced, and Chang issued an apology last Friday. He said it was a huge lapse in judgment. He said he should know better since he was a police officer. He called his own comments deplorable and said that he continued to stand with the people of Hong Kong. And I think the Liberals kind of wanted the story to end there, but of course it didn't.
Right. These stories never do. And especially in the context of the discourse in Canada around transnational repression, around foreign interference. Let's talk a little bit about the backlash. What have we heard from political leaders, from advocacy groups, and the public in response to this?
Yeah, I think the reaction was pretty swift from political parties and advocacy groups. I want to, in particular, on the political side, note two reactions. One from the conservatives, Michael Chong, and one from the NDP's Jenny Kwan. These are both candidates in this election, but they're also both longtime MPs for the conservatives and the NDP. They've both been targeted by Beijing before. And Chong said that the situation was outrageous and it was very disturbing to him. Kwan said that Chiang was playing right into Beijing's hands by making these comments. You know, she said, "In what universe is this normal?" But then we also have the reaction from dozens of Hong Kong advocacy groups. Over 40, over 40 diaspora organizations from Canada, in the US, in the UK, from Australia and Germany as well, issued a letter in which they had very strong opposition to Chang's remarks. They said that he was endorsing China's transnational rep- they said that he was endorsing China's transnational repression tactics, that he undermined democratic values in Canada, and urgently called for Carney to act on the situation. So it hasn't really been a situation that people have been divided on. It seems kind of like the reaction has kind of mostly skewed in one direction.
Right. And if you look at the past 72 hours or so and how things have transpired and escalated, it seemed like Paul Chiang initially tried to stay in the race and has stepped down, but only after days of backlash and pressure. Walk me through that a little bit. How did Mark Carney handle the situation? And what do you think was the turning point that has led to the recent updates with Chiang's departure?
So the first reaction we got from the Liberal Party was actually over the weekend when it had to be the media who asked them what they were going to do about this. They weren't very proactive here. So we got a statement that said that his comments were a lapse in judgment and acknowledged that Chang had apologized and that he stood with the people of Hong Kong. Obviously, this sparked a lot of backlash, especially since Carney did not address the comments himself. It came through a statement in an email. He only did that on Monday, so several days later, where he said again, you know, this was a terrible lapse. And then he also called it a teachable moment, which I think is a phrase that maybe rubbed some people the wrong way given the severity of the situation. So I think it was likely the wave of criticism that followed Carney's response, as well. The RCMP has since gotten involved. They have said that they launched a probe into the matter. So I think those things combined probably triggered the departure. It's also probably good to note that in a federal election, there is a deadline by which you have to nominate a candidate in a contest, and so that deadline is less than a week away. And I think the Liberals are probably weighing, you know, the longer that we sort of dilly dally on this, the shorter runway we have to nominate a candidate in Chang's place. So I'm sure that was something that Chang was thinking about as well.
Right. Talk to me a little bit about the statement that's come out almost, I would say, 3 days later when Carney did finally address the issue. He initially stood by Chang. Like you said in the statement, he called it a teachable moment. I don't think he has really publicly reversed his stance. I could have the wrong read on it. Talk to me a little bit more about that and the fact that his political opponents, including Pierre Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh, have framed it as a failure of leadership. So talk to me a little bit about that. What factors may have influenced that initial decision that he made, and what's been the perception to his approach throughout this?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are questioning how Carney handled this situation. You know, he essentially said Tuesday that it was Chang who offered his resignation himself and that Carney accepted it. So, at least from his public framing anyway, it appears as though Carney didn't act decisively himself to get rid of him, that it was Chang who approached him and said, "Hey, I don't want to be a distraction in this campaign. We have bigger issues. We have the threats from the US. I think it's better for me to bow out." So that's really interesting to note. Of course, we saw the conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, And the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, lambasted Carney for this on Tuesday as well. Polyev said Carney is just going to put his own interests before Canada's interests. Jagmeet Singh said that this was a failure of leadership. And they both kind of have points because people are going to interpret this as Carney wanting to boost his chances in a swing riding in what could be a very close campaign. The last thing that he wants now is to bleed seats to the Conservatives. And Markham Unionville was a riding that the Liberals had taken from the Conservatives in 2021. So undoubtedly, that played some sort of a role here, even if that's not something that he spoke about openly on Tuesday.
Hmm. A lot of people might be wanting to know a little bit more about foreign interference and transnational repression as it is in the context of this conversation, because that's the lens through which Chiang's comments have been looked at. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the significance of that and how it fits into the broader conversation that's taking place in Canadian politics around this issue, around the issue of foreign interference and transnational repression.
Yeah, so transnational repression, it's really interesting. In Canada, we don't have like a formal or legal definition of it. It's essentially when a state or a foreign government attempts to intimidate or silence members of a diaspora community in another country.
Mhm.
And this came up a number of times in the Hogue report that was released earlier this year. That was the report that came from the public inquiry into foreign interference. And transnational repression fell outside the scope of the inquiry, but it was included in the final report in a few different contexts. Justice Marie-Josée Hogue found that the issue was a genuine scourge. Those are the words that she used in Canada. And she identified it after hearing testimony from a lot of groups and a lot of people as one of the most prevalent forms of interference, foreign interference in this country. She also identified China as a very active player in perpetrating transnational repression in Canada. Other ways that this issue was raised in this report was that it kind of outlined how China works in this space. They are known for directing transnational repression towards several groups, including pro democracy activists from Hong Kong.
Mhm.
And it was also raised that it's really hard to detect China's efforts in Canada, which poses a big challenge to Canada's sovereignty and democracy. I think what's kind of important here is that beyond the impact on Canada itself, it has real impacts on people. Hogue heard from people who had been targeted by Beijing and by other countries and heard a lot about the impacts that it was having on their lives and their families' lives and the level of fear that they were feeling. And some of these people were really disappointed that the report wasn't able to dive into this issue more deeply. So it's clearly a topic that resonates with a lot of communities in Canada and deserves more attention.
Right. And it's a really important issue in the sense that Canada is a home to a lot of political dissidents for a lot of people from around the world who come here to find safety and refuge. So there are the emotional and psychological connotations of that as well, where people have the need to feel safe and protected in the country of refuge. You've already talked about this, Raisa, but I want to speak a little bit more about how Mark Carney's leadership style and has sort of come into the spotlight as a result of this. This is technically one of the first major public crisis that he's faced as Liberal leader. And you've already mentioned there's some perception in some quarters about there being a self-motivational or self-interest aspect to like how this was dealt with. What else does this tell us? I have been seeing some critique about the lack of being able to perhaps read the room or react under pressure to a situation. Tell me a little bit more about how this is being perceived, maybe within the party and by the public, reactions that you've seen on social media.
Yeah, and the public reactions and in the reactions from advocacy groups and opposition parties, especially, I think a lot of people are seizing on the fact that, there wasn't a lot of proactive decision making happening here. The fact that people, they were largely silent on day one, that people had to go out and seek answers on this issue was also interesting. And then after all of that, to have Carney come out at the start of this week and say, hey, it's a teachable moment instead of acting more decisively was really interesting. There are examples in elections often where something is dug up about a candidate, and usually parties move very swiftly to turf them. We've seen that in this campaign already, and so this was an example where that didn't happen. I don't know if this will have a huge impact on how people perceive him. But because we have so little information on how he conducts himself in situations like this, because he's so new to the political scene, it is really interesting to see that he went with this wait and see approach. In some ways, I guess you could argue that that makes sense because he was sussing the situation out. Like you want to be careful in these situations, not to end someone's career over something unless you have all the facts. This situation, of course, seemed a lot more cut and dry than some other examples that we've seen. And so it's interesting that he had an opportunity to take a tougher position and he chose not to take it. So I think there will be people questioning why that was the case.
The timing is also interesting and unfortunate, perhaps, where the liberals have been coming under fire, especially by the opposition on, some lack in trying to present a strong front against foreign interference, and they've been trying to build up on that, on presenting a stronger front against those issues to protect Canada's democracy and against foreign interference. How much damage do you think something like this does to their credibility or work on that front? Does this pose any challenges to that stance?
It's a really interesting question because it feels like, and this is so surprising, but feels like foreign interference has taken a backseat in this election campaign. This was an issue that seized a lot of people in the year leading up to the election, but now there are bigger issues. The threats posed by Donald Trump have absolutely just occupied everyone's brains since this campaign kicked off. And so I think in a situation where we see the issue of foreign interference becoming a bigger one in this campaign, it will reflect poorly on Carney and on the Liberals. I can see this as an example coming up in the debates. I'm sure that, Polyev and Singh might use it as a wedge against Carney. We saw Polyev on Tuesday saying, Carney is putting party first and not Canada first. So we even get some of that Trump framing woven into this situation. So I think kind of no matter how you slice it, it's a situation that definitely didn't help.
Right. I mean, it's early into the campaign, but I am wondering about the optics of all this and the fallout. Like you said, there are debates coming up as well.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the things the conservatives have been really successful with is painting the liberals, particularly under Justin Trudeau's leadership, as a party that flouts ethics and conflicts of interest rules. We saw that a lot in the year leading up to the election, and we've also seen that being used against Carney himself. The conservatives have spent a tremendous amount of time focusing on Carney's career before politics and his assets and any conflicts that may have arisen or will still arise there. I think when you have a situation like this one, it certainly doesn't help when it looks like you didn't want to turf a candidate because you wanted to win a riding, which of course Carney has never said that publicly, but that's what his critics are alleging. But also, kind of on the flip side, it might not have a huge impact. Candidates are ousted in elections all the time. Opposition parties spend vast amount of times trying to uncover dirt about a rival's candidate. Our colleague David Ryder went out into Markham Unionville on Tuesday and spoke to voters and found that the issue was not resonating hugely on the ground. One person thought that it was just a blip in the news cycle. Another was disappointed in Carney. Others said it wasn't that big of a deal. So I do think, on one hand, we do have a tendency to overestimate how much an issue is playing out in communities themselves, but that does not take away from the fact that the people who are actually impacted by these comments and are fearing for their lives have a really strong point as well.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for watching. Read more about this story in our coverage of the federal election on thestar.com, and do subscribe and support to our journalism. And don't forget to listen to This Matters wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Saba Eitizaz. Let's talk again soon.
Thank you.